Hey, how's it going? Give me 1 second. Oh, there we go. That looks a little better. How's it going? Let me just get my windows set up here. There we go. Bring this over here. All right, now I can see pretty well. Fabulous. So, I'm Tyler, and today we're going to be talking about Mendelian genetics. This is one of the most important topics on the TEAS exam, on the life science part of the TEAS exam. So what we're going to do today is this video is going to be a little bit different. As you can see, it's like a video, right? It's like I'm here, you can see I'm talking, I'll have some slides. But the idea of this video is that at the end of the day, it's a podcast. And what does that mean? That means that you don't even need to watch the video. You can learn just by listening. Look, I know people who are taking the TEAS are some of the busiest people in the world. Many of them have kids. Many of them are working full-time jobs. They're studying in the evening. They're studying in the morning. They're taking care of parents and relatives. And something that I hear from people all the time who are getting ready for the TEAS is just like, where do I get the time to study? Right? It's like, I feel you. I have a crazy busy life myself, and not everybody can just sit down in front of a book, sit down in front of a video for, half an hour, 2 hours, whatever at a time. But I bet you have time when you're cooking. I bet you have time when you're maybe, you're working out at the gym, you're walking the dog. If you've got kids, you're driving to preschool to drop them off. You're driving over to grandma's house to pick them up. And the idea with these podcasts is you can turn the podcast on. You don't have to look at anything. I mean, maybe once in a while, I'll be like, okay, look at the screen because there's a diagram that I want you to see. But maybe like 99% of what we're talking about, you can learn just by listening. You don't have to see anything. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be learning the basics of Mendelian genetics by listening. So you can chill out. You can watch this video if you want. If you like watching my, pasty white face, of course, I'm flattered if you want to watch the video. But you can also just listen along to it, and hopefully you'll everything you'll need to know you'll get from just from what we're talking about. Okay. So we're going to talk about Mendelian genetics. It's the basics of genetics. It's going to be the first of a couple podcasts that we'll do on this series. Now, people are still joining, so we're gonna wait for just a minute before we get ready, before we start. People who've seen others of my live streams know that sometimes I like to do like a little bit of a what do you call it? Like a little short at the beginning of this while we're waiting for people to show up. And so I like to talk about things that frustrate or worry people who are getting ready for the TEAS. So for about 2 or 3 minutes while people are still joining before we get going on the podcast, I want to talk about this. Today's topic is, I call it, I wasted $250 on a TEAS scam so that you don't have to. Okay? I bet most of you know what I'm talking about here, right? If you spend any time online looking at Facebook groups, you look at TikTok comments, you look at, YouTube videos, you're going to say, you spend 5 minutes in these groups and you are going to start seeing comments that sound like this. They say, thank the Lord in heavens, I just passed the TEAS with a 98%. And I did that with study resources that were given to me by, and the name is always different, right? It's Mr. Bill Cunningham. And if you want to have his study resources too, send me a DM or, hit me up on WhatsApp at this number. Okay. Now, there are a lot of people who get very interested in this, right? Because everyone wants to pass the TEAS. Everyone wants to have study resources that help them pass the TEAS. And, I started seeing messages like this a lot. And I'm kind of a curious person. And so I decided to do a little bit of investigation. And so I started reaching out to these people. Okay. And it's always the same kind of thing. Okay. Let me just move the mic here. You reach out to them and then they say, okay, here's the deal. I have the answers to the TEAS. I have the answers to the exam. You tell me when you're going to be taking the exam, and I will send you the answers. Okay? And they say, now look at this Facebook page that I have. This is a Facebook page of all these other people that I've helped. And you go and look at the Facebook, and it's filled with these people who say, oh my goodness, I got these resources from so-and-so, and I got a 98%. I got a 95%. I looked over them for 5 minutes and I got a 100%. Okay. So they say, well, look at the Facebook page. It's filled with testimonials from people who've used my materials, and they've all passed. So all I need to know from you is the date that you're going to be taking the TEAS, and then pay me $250, Venmo or Bitcoin or something like that, and I will send you the exam questions. Okay. I got really curious about this, and I wanted to know, is this real or is this a total scam? Okay. I had a feeling it was scammy, but they say, oh, I know somebody. The story's always a little bit different, but it's always pretty much the same. Oh, I know somebody who works at ATI and they give me the answers. Or I pay people to take the exam and then they give me the questions, I give them the answer. It's always something like that. I have an inside connection, right? So, okay, so I did it. And I gave them the $250. I told them when I was going to take the TEAS. I wasn't planning to take the TEAS, but I just made up a date. And they sent me the answers after I gave them about $250, okay? I knew right away that I'd been scammed. And I'll tell you why I knew that I'd been scammed. Because they sent me a PDF that I had seen floating around for years and years. There's a PDF that sometimes floats around. It's like, oh, these are the answers to the TEAS. These are questions you can expect. And boom, there it was. I paid $250 for this thing that I had seen for maybe the past 3 or 4 years. I didn't think the questions on that were ever on the TEAS. Maybe they were. Maybe they were questions for like the TEAS 6 exam or something like that. I'd seen this thing 3 or 4 years ago, right? I paid $250 for this scammy PDF that's been floating around for 3 or 4 years. That's not even relevant anymore, right? And so I reached back out to them and I said, I know this is a scam because I've seen this PDF 4 years ago. It's been floating around for years. There's no way that this is like tomorrow's TEAS exam, right? And yeah, so I say a comment here. Is that Brandy's TEAS PDF? Everybody has a different name, but it's like, there's PDF that's floating around and it has old questions from, millions of years ago on the TEAS. It's not any help at all. And maybe it's Brandy's PDF or whatever. And so I get this thing and I reach out to the person. I'm like, this thing is there's no way this is, the TEAS questions I'm going to see. And here's what they say. Because they don't know I'm just, testing it. And they say, listen, if you say anything about this, you shut up. And if you say anything about this, I will track you down in the future. If you give me any trouble about this, you're not getting your money back. And if you give me any trouble in the future, I'm going to track you down. I'm going to find out where you go to nursing school or sonography school. And I'm going to send them the DMs that you sent me. And I'm going to tell them that you paid for the answers. And I'm going to say that was academic dishonesty. I'm going to get you kicked out of school. Now that's called blackmail, right? So now they're blackmailing me. Now they don't know that I have, I'm not planning to go to nursing school or anything, but they don't know what the deal is, right? So then they threaten me. And so, I just say, okay, so that, it's kind of satisfying for me because I get to figure out how the scam works. And I'm always curious about things like that. So it's clearly like it's a scam. The reason why you never hear anybody complaining about these scams is because they tell them, if you say anything about this, we'll find out where you're going to go to school, we'll blackmail you, we'll extort you, whatever. So that is why you see all these, oh, here, pay this money to get the answer to the TEAS, but you never see anybody posting on Facebook. Sometimes you do, but not often do you see somebody posting on Facebook and saying, hey, I want to let you know that this person's running a scam. And they don't do that, usually, I would assume, because they are being threatened by the people who scammed them. They are being threatened or blackmailed by the people who scammed them. So this is how the scam works. You see this on Facebook. You see this on YouTube. And that's how it works. So at the end of the day, if somebody comes along and says, give me some money, I have the answers to the TEAS, they are scamming you. And anyone who says, no, trust this person because they gave me the answers. You see a Facebook page filled with comments that say, oh, Brandy Johnson helped me with the TEAS, give her the money. It's a fake Facebook account or they're getting paid to post that. The thing is a scam. And if you fall for it, you're going to lose your money and you might get blackmailed or extorted too. Okay? So my advice, don't go down that road. To sum it all up, I wasted $250 on a TEAS scam so you can know how it works and so that you don't have to make that mistake. Got it? Any questions about that? Stay away from scams. There's pretty much only one way to do well on the TEAS, and that is to just study the stuff and learn it. All right. That was a little short at the beginning of this YouTube live, beginning of this podcast. And now I think we're ready to get going. So what we're going to be talking about today is genetics. This is part of the life science unit, genetics and Punnett squares. Okay. And today we're going to be talking about part of that unit. We're going to be talking about these things. Okay. These are probably terms that you've seen on practice questions. You've probably seen them in TEAS study guides and outlines. So just to give you a little preview of what we'll be talking about, we're going to be talking about genes, alleles, and traits. We're going to be talking about genotype and phenotype. All of this relates to the idea of Mendelian inheritance. I'm going to tell you what that means if you have no idea what I'm talking about there. We're going to talk about how traits can be dominant and recessive. And finally, we're going to talk about two big vocab words, homozygous and heterozygous. By the end of our podcast today, you will understand what all of that is. And you're going to learn it just by listening. We're going to go slow. We're going to go step by step. If you have watched other videos or you have been drowning in TEAS test prep books and you've thought, I cannot understand this, it makes no sense, spend an hour here with me in this podcast, and I can almost guarantee you it's going to make sense by the end of it. And you're going to think, whoa, the problem is not me. I can understand this. The problem is these videos. The problem is these books. The problem is these study resources. They are not helping. Problem is not you. The problem is that you probably are not using study resources that are helping. So somebody here has their TEAS this Thursday. I hope this video helps. This stuff is prime, high value material. The problems are the questions and how they're worded. Says a commenter here. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's one of the reasons why we do lots and lots and lots of practice problems. In this podcast, we're not going to do too many TEAS style practice problems because they're hard to understand when you're just listening. Those are better for when you're reading. So I have other videos where we're doing this. In this video, we're going to be talking about a lot of this vocab information, a lot of this fundamental information. We're doing like sort of quick, rapid fire questions and answers. Okay, so let's get going here. Genetics and Punnett squares. What I'm going to be doing is I am going to be doing a little bit of writing here. So if you're following along and you're looking at the screen, you'll see that I'm writing words here and there. But for the most part, I'm just doing that to provide a little bit of visual stuff that you can look at. I'm only doing it so that we can sort of have an outline. You don't have to worry too much about what I'm writing because I'm going to be trying to explain everything by what I'm saying, right? So you can listen and you can learn. Okay, so let's start out. It's going to be like I'm sort of like telling a story, like we're doing a podcast. So you can just kind of, you can chill out and you can listen and you can understand what we're going to be talking about. So this podcast is fundamentally about inheritance and genetics. Okay. And inheritance is a fancy word for how something passes from parents to children, right? You probably know about inheritance because maybe it's some money that passes from a parent to children when the parent passes away. Maybe it's some money, maybe it's some property, but the idea of inheriting a house is how something passes from parents to children. Okay? Now, when we're talking about genetics and inheritance, we're not talking about houses and savings accounts. We are talking about traits and characteristics that get passed from parents to children, right? If you look at a family, just like look at a family walking down the street, right? It's no secret that kids look like their parents. They don't look exactly like them, but they look like their parents because there are traits and characteristics that the parents have that are passed down to their kids. So when we're talking about inheritance in this life science kind of way, we're talking about qualities, characteristics, and traits that are passed from parents to their children. And genetics is just a fancy word for the science of how that happens. Scientists and doctors who study genetics study how traits are passed from parents to children, and they study how those traits happen or how they come about in a particular person. Okay? That's at the end of the day what inheritance and genetics is. If you got any questions, feel free to put it in the chat because I love doing this step by step and I love addressing your questions. Now, traits and characteristics are one of the most important things when it comes to inheritance. Okay? We all have sort of an intuitive sense of what traits and characteristics are. Okay? I'm going to use these words to pretty much mean the same thing. And a trait or a characteristic is a quality or it's a property about somebody or something that you can use to describe it. So you think about yourself, you think about your kids, you think about your best friend, your mind is going to be filled with various traits and characteristics, right? They have brown hair, they have curly hair, they have blue eyes, they have long legs, they have, if you're thinking about me, a pasty white skin that can barely tan. You know, they have blonde eyebrows. They have a dark beard. All these sort of things are traits and characteristics. They're properties of an individual that we can use to describe them. Okay, so these are all traits. Okay. When we think about other organisms, other living things, there are lots and lots of traits that could be used to describe them too. We can think about plants. A lot of genetics has to do with plants. People figured out how inheritance works in plants before they figured it out in many other living things. So you can think about the color of flowers as a trait, how tall a plant grows. If you're thinking about something like peas, well, maybe the peas are green or maybe they're yellow, maybe they're wrinkled, maybe they're round. Those are traits. A dog, maybe a dog has short hair. Maybe a dog has long hair. That's a trait or a characteristic. Maybe the dog has ears that stand up, or maybe its ears are floppy. You know, maybe the dog has a curly tail. Maybe the dog has a straight tail. Okay, I'm giving you all these traits and characteristics just so you can fix them in your mind. Okay, these are traits and characteristics. Now, we want to see how these are passed from parents to children. And this is the first new vocabulary word that we're going to talk about that is probably sort of unfamiliar to many of you. And that is the word offspring. Offspring is a fancy word for children or kids. And I'm talking about inheritance from parents to children. But if I were really being technical about it, I would be talking about inheritance from parents to offspring. Okay? Offspring is a fancy word for children. Something else I want to say about this podcast, I'm going to be saying things like sort of over and over Not because I'm trying to bore you, not because I think you're dumb, but because that is how we learn. We learn through repetition. You think about a kid learning, language. I don't know how many freaking times you got to tell them that a fork is a fork. You point to it and you're like, this is a fork. This is a fork. This is a fork. That's how we learn. We learn through repetition. And so that's why I'm intentionally repeating things, because that's how it's going to get the information to stick in your mind. So offspring. Offspring is a fancy word for children. Okay? When we're talking about humans, yeah, sure, children make sense. We say, oh, traits and characteristics are passed from parents to kids or from parents to children. But there's a lot of other stuff out there where, the word children is kind of weird, right? We think about, a rose plant, okay? And then the rose plant, like the seeds come off and it makes like another rose plant. Okay, we don't really think of those as like kids, or even when we're thinking about something like fruit flies, we got a bunch of fruit flies and they have babies. I don't know, we don't really think of those as like kids, there's a fruit flies kids. So that's why I like to use this term offspring. That's why scientifically we use this term offspring. It's like parents pass on traits and characteristics to offspring. You think of them as kids, you can think of them as children, but really offspring is a technical word for kids, whether they're pea plants or whether they're fruit flies or whether they're snails or whether they're, whatever. Parents to offspring. So when we're thinking about traits and characteristics in parents and offspring, we are usually thinking about what I'm going to call phenotypes. And a phenotype is an observable trait. It's a trait that we can see. Okay? Observable trait. I listed a whole bunch of traits earlier, and those are all kind of examples of phenotypes. A phenotype is an observable trait that we can see or measure scientifically. I'll talk about that in just a minute so you can know what it means. But think about this. Okay. Phenotype. Let's think of an example. Blue eyes. There's an observable trait. Let's think of another one. Brown hair. There's a phenotype. There's an observable trait. I can observe that. Maybe you've got brown hair. I can take a look at you. I can say, your hair is brown. Boom, there's a phenotype. Maybe your hair is curly. I can look at you and I can say, boom, look at that. You have curly hair. That's an observable trait. That's a phenotype. Now, those are all things that I can observe with my eyes. But in science, the term observe doesn't just mean what we can see with our eyes. It also means what we could measure scientifically. Okay, so maybe I can look at you and I can tell that you're quite tall, right? So that's an observable trait. I can say, oh, yeah, she's really tall. But I could also measure that, right? I could get out my special ruler and I can be like, this woman is 6 feet 2 inches tall. That's really tall, right? So now I'm measuring it scientifically. Maybe I can't see something fully with my eyes. I can see you're tall, but I don't know exactly how tall you are, so I can measure it scientifically, right? There are other phenotypes that maybe we can't see at all with our eyes, but that we can measure scientifically. So we can say that we can observe them. Okay, for example, let's say that somebody has a trait or characteristic where they break down alcohol really slowly. Okay, some people have this problem, right? They have a drink and they stay drunk or they stay intoxicated for a very long period of time because it takes them so long to break down that alcohol. That's a trait or characteristic, right? That can be a trait or characteristic that they are not good at metabolizing alcohol. Well, if you look at somebody, yeah, maybe they're looking a little bit weird if they're intoxicated. But generally, we can measure that scientifically. We could look at their blood and we could say, wow, look, the alcohol stays in their blood for a very long period of time. And there's a phenotype. There's an observable trait. We can measure that scientifically. We could look at somebody's blood and maybe they have high blood sugar. Maybe they have a trait or a characteristic that they have is they have high blood sugar. And that's caused by something that was passed from parents to offspring. We can't just look at somebody and tell if they have high blood sugar, but we can observe it by measuring it scientifically. So I hope that kind of makes sense, right? Phenotype is something that is an observable trait. You can see it with your eyes if it's an appearance, but it also might be something like blood sugar in their blood, or how fast they break down alcohol after they have a drink, that we don't observe with our eyes, but we can observe it by doing some sort of a test or measuring it scientifically. Okay, so I hope all of that makes sense. And if you've got any questions, just bring it on. So to review everything that we've talked about, because I know some people are just listening while they're at the gym, they're listening while they're cooking. I want to make sure that we're not losing anybody here. We're talking about inheritance in genetics, which is how traits and characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. And offspring is a fancy technical word that means children. Now, when we're talking about traits and characteristics in the context of genetics, we're usually talking about phenotypes. And a phenotype is an observable trait that we can see. We can see it with our eyes, usually if it's an appearance, or it's something we can measure scientifically. Maybe it has something to do with somebody's blood. What blood type they are, A, B, or O, that's something we can measure scientifically. We do a little test in the lab and figure out what's their blood type, okay? That's a phenotype. We can't observe it with our eyes by just looking at somebody. But we can do a little scientific test and we can figure out, oh, they're type AB blood. There's another example of a phenotype. As somebody just added into the chat, yeah, phenotype equals physical, okay? pH, for those of you who are just listening, phenotype is spelled PHENOTYPE, pH. Phenotype is physical. It's something physical about an individual, a trait or a characteristic. So that can be a good way to remember it. Now, if there are any questions, please just let me know. Now, we have all these traits and characteristics in our bodies, as do all living things. And now, where do those traits and characteristics come from? Most traits, pretty much all traits, but I'm saying most because there are a few exceptions. Most traits are determined by genes. And you know that, right? Genes are present in DNA, and DNA is passed from parents to offspring. Okay? So you get DNA from your dad, and you get DNA from your mom, and the genes on that DNA give information about what your traits should look like. So let's think about a phenotype, okay? A phenotype, for example, somebody has blue eyes, okay? The DNA that they have in their body gives information about how their eyes should be blue, okay? So genes give information. Genes give information about traits. Genes give information about traits. If somebody has a certain type of a certain type of hair, whether it's straight or curly, there are genes in their body that give information about how their hair should look. Now, and we could do that for lots and lots and lots and lots of different traits. Okay, so let's think about this. Genes. Where do we find genes? We find genes on DNA. And a long string of DNA would have many, many, many genes on it, okay? A long piece of DNA would have many, many, many genes. And those genes give information about all sorts of different traits, okay? We got a gene for what color your eyes should be. And we have a gene for what color your hair should be. And we have a gene for whether your hair should be straight or curly. And we could go on and on and on. We have a whole bunch of genes on DNA. And in an organism like humans, all of the DNA that we have is broken up into smaller pieces called chromosomes. These chromosomes are pieces of DNA that are like a more manageable size. Okay, so we have chromosomes. Chromosomes are smaller pieces of DNA sort of broken up into a more manageable size. And each chromosome has many, many genes. This is the kind of thing that the TEAS really likes to ask about. Each chromosome has many, many genes. So, all of the DNA that a person has is divided up into a bunch of chromosomes. And each chromosome has many, many genes. The TEAS loves to ask, like, which is bigger? They love to say, like, does a gene have many chromosomes? Does a chromosome have many genes? Stuff like that. So, all of the DNA that somebody has in their body is divided up into a bunch of different chromosomes. And each of those chromosomes has many, many genes on it. Chromosomes are long pieces of DNA, and they contain many, many genes. Now, DNA and chromosomes and genes are passed from parent to offspring. Okay? The reason why traits and characteristics are passed from parents to offspring is because DNA is passed from parents to offspring. The DNA that is in chromosomes contains the information about traits and characteristics. Okay? And it's that DNA that is passed from parent to offspring that is carrying the information about traits and characteristics. Okay? You can think about this DNA in the chromosomes like books or instruction manuals about what traits and characteristics should look like. So anyway, taking a sip of water here. DNA is passed from parent to offspring. DNA contains information about traits and characteristics, and that is why traits and characteristics are passed from parent to offspring, because information about traits and characteristics is carried on DNA. It's carried on chromosomes. I'm saying that over and over again because the TEAS loves to ask that. Information about traits and characteristics can be found on DNA. DNA is broken up into smaller chromosomes. Each chromosome has many, many genes. Okay, boom. That's like the first big piece of information. The first big section is everything we've talked about here. We have talked about traits and characteristics being passed from parent to offspring. We've talked about phenotypes, which are observable traits that we can see with our eyes or we can measure scientifically. Well, where does the information about traits and characteristics come from? It comes from genes. Where do we find genes? We find genes on DNA. The DNA in an organism like a human is divided up into chromosomes. Each chromosome has many, many genes. DNA is passed from parents to offspring. Got it? So we've talked about inheritance. how traits and characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. We've talked about what offspring means. It's a fancy word for kids. We've talked about traits and characteristics, which are properties or qualities that we can use to describe something. We've talked about phenotypes, various traits or characteristics that we can see or that we can observe scientifically. We've talked about genes. We've talked about chromosomes. We've talked about DNA. And we can say that traits or characteristics are observable by scientific methods. I'm saying this stuff over and over again so that it will stick in your mind like glue. I never want you to forget what a phenotype is because, it's going to show up on the TEAS. Phenotype is going to show up on the TEAS. The TEAS is going to be like, what is a phenotype? It's going to try to trick you. And a phenotype, what is it? It is a physical characteristic of an organism that you can see or you can measure. Okay, now, I want to keep an eye on the chat here. If this is helpful, let me know. If this is not helpful, let me know. If you want to make sure that I talk about certain things, let me know. I hope that going slow and step by step is making sense to people, and I hope that it's helping this information stick in your mind. Now, we talked about genes, and we talked about genes giving information about traits. Now, there's something in the chat that is an example. What's an example of a measurable phenotype? Okay, I talked about some of these a minute ago, but let me review in case you hadn't joined. An example of a measurable phenotype. Blood type. There's a great phenotype, right? Let's say somebody pricks their finger. The blood starts bleeding, I look at the blood with my eyes. I don't know what blood type they are. I can't see that, right? That's not observable with my eyes. But I can do a little test with a blood typing kit, and I can figure out, is it A blood? Is it B blood? Is it AB blood? Is it O blood? That is something you can measure. That's a phenotype. That is a physical trait about somebody that you can measure by scientific methods. I can't see it with my eyes, but I can observe it with scientific methods, right? Or another thing that's in the chat, blood glucose, okay? The amount of blood sugar somebody has in their blood. They prick their finger, drop of blood. I can't look at that and be like, oh yes, there's a lot of blood glucose in there, right? I can't observe that. But I could do a test in the lab and I could say, oh, this person has a very, very high amount of glucose in their blood. They have very high blood sugar. And there are traits and characteristics that can lead somebody to have a very high level of blood sugar, right? So those are examples of things that we can't see with our eyes, but that are observable in the lab, that are observable by scientific methods. And that's a term that the TEAS just loves. I want to tell you that right now. Observable by scientific methods is a way that they talk about phenotype. Okay, so I hope those two examples, blood type and something like blood glucose, are examples of physical traits that are observable by scientific methods. Let me know if there are any other questions about that. Let me have a sip of water. And now we are going to do a deep dive into genes. Genes are parts of DNA that give information about various traits and characteristics. Okay, now, for almost every trait, we have 2 copies of each gene. 2 copies of each gene. We got one from mom and one from dad. That's why we have 2 copies. So, let's think about eye color. Eye color is a little bit more complicated, but we usually talk about it like this. So I'm going to do the same thing. Think about eye color. For the color that your eye should be, there are 2 sets of instructions that say what the eye color should be. 2 different genes. For hair curliness should your hair be curly or straight? Well, there's a gene that tells your body whether your hair should be curly or straight. And there are 2 copies of that gene. Okay? For something like a fruit fly, should its eyes be white or should its eyes be red? Well, there's a gene that gives information about that characteristic, and that fruit fly has 2 copies of that gene. Got one from mom, and it got one from dad. Okay? Now, these 2 copies are not always the same, and they combine in interesting ways. And these different copies of a gene are called alleles. Alleles. Different copies, different versions of a gene. Let's think about hair curliness. There is a gene, as we said, for hair curliness. There's a gene that determines whether your hair is going to be curly or whether it's going to be straight. Okay? But there are different versions of that gene. There is a version for straight hair, and we call that an allele. There is another version for curly hair, and we call that another allele. So there are different versions of the gene that tells us about hair curliness. Okay? Something about, same thing with eye color. There's a gene that tells your body what your eye color should be. But we have 2 copies of that gene. And there is a version for blue eyes. There is a version for brown eyes. And these are called alleles. Okay. Good. I see a question in the chat. I'm going to get to it in just a second. So we have alleles. Alleles are different versions of a gene. Okay? For essentially every trait, we have a gene that determines what that trait is going to be. Okay? Hair curliness. There's a gene for that. We have 2 copies of that gene. Eye color. There's a gene for the color that our eyes should be. We have 2 copies of that gene. We have a blue eye copy and we have a brown eye copy, right? It doesn't mean that we all have those, but those are different versions of that gene. Those are different versions of that gene. So, very important to know. And if you got any questions, let me know. Let me know about that. Let me address a comment that I see here in the chat, and it's talking about sex of a baby. Okay, so sex of a baby, sex of an individual, comes from the chromosomes. Okay, now females have 2 X chromosomes. Males have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. Okay, so that's what determines gender. Now, think about this. When 2 people get together and have a kid, a female has X chromosomes. Okay, she only has X chromosomes. She's only got X chromosomes. She has 2 X chromosomes. She can only give a baby an X chromosome. The father has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. He can give the baby an X chromosome or he can give the baby a Y chromosome. So, The mother can only give the baby an X chromosome. Baby gets one of those. The mother only gives a baby an X chromosome. But the father has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So if the baby gets an X chromosome from the dad, it's going to be X from the mom, X from the dad. Boom, we have a female baby. But think about the other example. We get an X chromosome from the mom and we get a Y chromosome from the dad. Now the baby is X, Y. We have a male baby. So that's how it works. That's how it works. And that's why, to the point in the comment there, does the dad decide the sex of the baby? It's not like the dad decides it, but a Y chromosome, which makes a baby male, can only come from the dad because the mom doesn't have a Y chromosome. So if the baby is going to be a male, it has to get an X chromosome from the mom because that's the only option it has. It has to get a Y chromosome from the dad. So that's how it works. So as we were saying for genes, we have 2 copies of each gene from mom and from dad. We got one from mom, one from dad. And we have different versions of these genes. Okay? We have different versions of these genes, and we call these alleles. Okay. Let's take a look at some different examples of what genes could look like in somebody. Okay? Take a look at this. Let's think about here. I'm gonna pull up I got a list here of some stuff to think about here. Let's go back to our example of blue eyes, brown eyes. Okay? Let's think about eye color. Okay? We got eye color. Let's think about some different examples of what could happen with somebody and their genes for eye color. Okay, now, let's say that we're talking about 2 alleles. 2 alleles for eye color. We have a brown eye version of the gene, and we have a blue eye. We have a blue, I started writing blonde, and we have a blue eye version of the gene. Okay, so check this out. Let's look at some different options. Here's one person. Okay, we've said that each person has 2 copies of each gene. Okay, so let's say for eye color, somebody could have 1 copy of the brown eye gene and another copy of the brown eye gene. Okay, here's somebody else. Somebody else could have 1 copy of the brown eye gene and 1 copy of the blue eye gene. Or somebody could have a situation where they have 1 copy of the blue eye gene and another copy of the blue eye gene. So you see what I mean when I say that people can have, when people have two copies of the gene, but there are different versions or alleles of a gene, right? So here what we're doing, we're talking about eye color, and we're saying, well, we have these 2 versions of the gene. There's a brown eye version and there's a blue eye version. Okay? So people can have different combinations of these genes. They could have 2 brown eye genes. They could have 1 brown eye gene and 1 blue eye gene, or they could have 2 blue eye genes or 2 blue eye alleles. So what I'm talking about in these examples is what we call genotype. Genotype is the combination of genes that people have. Okay? Genotype. Combination of genes. And for genotype, we could say, well, this person's genotype is they have 2 brown eye alleles. Or we could say they have 1 brown eye allele, 1 blue eye allele. Or we can say they have 2 blue eye alleles. These are all examples of genotypes. 2 brown alleles, 2 blue alleles, 1 brown allele, 1 blue allele. We have 2 copies of each gene, but we might have different versions of that gene. Okay? So the genotype is the type, the combination of genes that somebody has. Okay? Now, we're going to pull all of this information together because we are going to look at how these different versions of the gene come together. Okay? Different combinations of genes lead to different traits and characteristics, different phenotypes. Okay? If somebody has 2 copies of the brown eye gene, they will have brown eyes. We call this the phenotype. That is the trait. If somebody has 2 copies of the blue eye gene, they will have a phenotype of blue eyes. 2 copies of the blue eye gene, they're going to have a phenotype of blue eyes. Okay? 2 copies of the brown eye gene, that's the genotype. But their eyes are actually brown, that's the phenotype. 2 copies of the blue eye gene, that is the genotype. But they actually have blue eyes, that is the phenotype. Okay? Now, you might be wondering, what do we do in this situation here in the middle? We've talked about a situation where we have a person has 1 copy of the brown eye gene and 1 copy of the blue eye gene. What's their phenotype then? It turns out that when somebody has 1 copy of the brown eye allele and 1 copy of the blue eye allele, their phenotype, the actual characteristic that they have is brown eyes. So let me just review all this so that we can then take next steps. All right? If you have 2 copies of the brown eye allele, that's your genotype. And the way you look, your phenotype is brown eyes. If you have 2 copies of the blue eye allele, that's your genotype. 2 copies of the blue eye gene. Your phenotype, the way you actually look, is blue eyes. If you have 1 copy of the brown eye allele and 1 copy of the blue eye allele, that's your genotype. 1 brown, 1 blue, but your phenotype, the way you actually look, is brown eyes. So to address a comment in the questions, phenotype equals the genetic copies a person has, and phenotype equals the presenting characteristic. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Could not say it better myself. Genotype is the combination of gene copies a person has, 2 brown, 2 blue, 1 brown, 1 blue. But phenotype is the trait and characteristic that is caused by those genes. somebody has brown eyes, or somebody has blue eyes. Okay? Let me give you a few other examples. We're just going to talk through this, okay? Because I want you to get used to hearing it. Okay. I want you to tell me, are these genotypes or are they phenotypes? Okay. A fruit fly has 2 copies of a gene for long wings. Genotype or phenotype? That is a genotype. When you look at a fruit fly, it has red eyes. Genotype or phenotype? That is phenotype. A fruit fly has 1 gene for red eyes and 1 gene for white eyes. Phenotype or genotype? That is a genotype. 1 gene or 1 allele for red eyes, 1 gene or 1 allele for white eyes. Genotype. Now, you look at the fruit fly, it has white eyes. Genotype or phenotype? That is phenotype. You look at it, you observe it, it has white eyes. Okay. A human has 2 copies of the gene for curly hair. Is that genotype or phenotype? 2 copies of the allele for curly hair. Genotype. A human has straight hair. What's that? That is phenotype. That's phenotype because it's how they look. They have straight hair. Okay. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about here is how genes come together. Let's go back to our eyes example. 2 copies of brown eyes. 2 copies of the brown eye gene, you have brown eyes. 2 copies of the blue eye gene, you have blue eyes. 1 copy of the brown eye gene, 1 copy of the blue eye gene, you have brown eyes. There's something special about the brown eye gene here. The brown eye gene, we could say, is stronger than the blue eye gene. The brown eye gene can overpower the blue eye gene. Because if you have 1 copy of the brown eye allele and 1 copy of the blue eye allele, it doesn't matter that you have that blue eye copy because you still have brown eyes. The brown eye allele can overpower the blue eye allele. Does that make sense? If you have 2 copies of the brown eye allele, you get brown eyes. If you have 2 copies of the blue eye allele, you get blue eyes. But all you need is 1 copy of the blue eye. All you need is 1 copy of the brown eye allele, and you've got brown eyes. 1 brown allele, 1 blue allele. Your eyes are brown, and we call this a dominant allele. Dominant. A dominant allele is something that can overpower other alleles. There are more technical ways that we can describe it, but that's what I'm going to say right here. A dominant allele can overpower the other alleles. And the opposite of a dominant allele is, let me write this down here. The opposite of a dominant allele is a recessive allele. Recessive allele gets overpowered. Okay. we are going to do some practice with this. We are going to look at some genotypes, and you are going to tell me, or you're going to think, whether these are dominant or whether they are recessive. Let's talk about fruit flies. Okay. In fruit flies, here is a genotype. We're going to talk about eye color. If a fruit fly has one copy of the gene for white eyes and one copy of the gene for red eyes, their phenotype will be red eyes. Which is dominant and which is recessive? If a fruit fly has one allele for white eyes and one allele for red eyes, its phenotype will be red eyes. That means that red is dominant. Okay? Let's do this again. If a pea plant has one gene for yellow seeds and another gene for green seeds, the phenotype will be yellow seeds. Who is dominant and who is recessive? One copy of the yellow seed allele, one copy of the green seed allele, and the phenotype is yellow seeds. Yellow is dominant. And we'll do one more. If a dog has one copy of the upright ears allele and one copy of the floppy ears allele, their phenotype will be upright ears. Which allele is dominant? Is it upright ears or is it floppy ears? One copy of the upright ears allele, one copy of the floppy ears allele, and they have upright genes. So upright ears is dominant, floppy ears is recessive. Okay. So let's put together everything that we have learned. Alleles are usually abbreviated with letters. The dominant allele gets an uppercase letter. The recessive allele gets a lowercase allele. So let's take a look at an example. I have my list of things here and I want to find something that's interesting. Okay? The ability to roll your tongue, to put your tongue like into a tube, that's actually a genetic trait. Okay? So let's look at this. Tongue rolling. Okay. Now, can roll tongue, that's the allele. Can roll tongue allele is a capital R. Cannot roll tongue allele, that is a lowercase r. Okay? So now, let's look at some combinations of these alleles and figure out what the phenotype is going to be. Okay, let's say we have capital R, capital R, capital R, lowercase r, lowercase r, lowercase r. What are the phenotypes going to be? The yes, you can roll your tongue allele is capital R. The no, you cannot roll your tongue allele is lowercase r. Now, if something is an uppercase, that means that it is a dominant allele. So let's talk through this. Capital R is two copies of the yes, you can roll your tongue allele. So that means that you can roll tongue. If somebody has two copies of that allele, they can roll their tongue. If somebody has two copies of little r, the you cannot roll your tongue allele, they cannot roll the tongue. But here's my question. When they have one capital R and one lowercase r, can they roll their tongue or can they not roll their tongue? They have a capital R and a lowercase r. That means they have one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele. The dominant allele always overpowers the recessive allele in this case, and that means that they can roll their tongue. Because rolling their tongue is the dominant trait. So all they need is one copy of that capital R, and they can roll their tongue. Let's do another one here. Because the other day, I meant to delete this. The other day when we were doing this and people were confused, and I wanted to make sure that they didn't get confused. Okay? Now, in fruit flies, wings, okay? Wing size. There is a gene that determines wing size, okay? So, big wings, capital W. Tiny wings, lowercase w. Okay, let's look at three genotypes that we can have. Big W, big W. Big W, little w, or little w, little w. In each case, let's figure out what they're going to look like. Big wings, capital W. Tiny wings is lowercase w. So what does that mean? The capital W means dominant. The lowercase w means recessive. A capital W, a dominant gene, means that it overpowers the other one. So capital W will have big wings. Little w will have tiny wings. Big W, little w, we have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So what are we going to get? The dominant is going to overpower the recessive allele, which means that we are going to get big wings, because big wings is dominant. So when you have one allele for the dominant trait and one allele for the recessive trait doesn't matter. The dominant takes over. One copy of the dominant, one copy of the recessive, you get the dominant trait. Okay? This is so important we're going to do one more example of this, and then we're going to finish with just a little bit of jargon review so that you're all ready. Okay, let's look at in dogs, we have hair texture. There's a gene that controls hair texture in dogs. So, and wiry hair, kind of coarse hair is capital H. Smooth hair is lowercase h. Here's some possible genotypes for a dog. Big H, big H, big H, little h, little h, little h. Which one is dominant? Which is recessive? Wiry hair is dominant. Smooth hair is recessive. So let's go step by step here. If a dog has 2 copies of the wiry hair alleles, it is going to have wiry hair. If a dog has 2 copies of the smooth hair allele, it's going to have smooth hair. But when it has 1 copy of wiry and 1 copy of smooth, it is going to be wiry, because wiry is dominant. Got it? Now, let's go back and talk about a little bit of jargon that I have left out here. Let's take a look at some generic phenotypes. Capital A, capital A, capital A, lowercase a, lowercase a, lowercase a. Dominant is capital A, and recessive is lowercase a. Capital A, we call that homozygous dominant. Homozygous means you have the same allele. So capital A, we have the same allele, so it is homozygous dominant. Lowercase a is homozygous recessive. Homozygous means you have the same allele. So little a is homozygous recessive. This situation where we have capital A, lowercase a, we call that heterozygous, because the alleles are different. The alleles are different. Heterozygous. So capital A, homozygous dominant. Lowercase a, homozygous recessive. Heterozygous, capital A, lowercase a. Okay, let's do one more practice question on this. We're going to do it a little bit differently this time. A little bit differently. Let's say that we have fruit flies, and a body color of a fruit fly is governed by genes. And so we have a gray body is a capital G, and we have a black body is a lowercase g. So I want to look at some genotypes. I want to know, what is the homozygous recessive going to be? What is going to be the genotype? And then I want to know what the phenotype is going to be. Okay, I'm going to just make a little chart here. And then I want to know the homozygous dominant. Then I want to know heterozygous. For each of those, I want to know what genotype and phenotype is going to be. First, let's do the genotype. So, homozygous recessive, what is the genotype going to be? We need to remember two things here. We need to remember that homozygous means they are the same, okay? It means that the alleles are the same, and we need to remember that recessive alleles are lowercase. So a genotype that is homozygous recessive is going to be lowercase g, lowercase g. What is its phenotype going to be? Well, it's going to be black. Homozygous dominant. What is that genotype going to be? Homozygous means that the alleles are going to be the same. They're going to be the same, okay? So, capital G, because dominant is uppercase. What is that phenotype going to be? That is going to be gray, because the dominant allele is gray. Now, heterozygous. What's a heterozygous here? It's one of each, capital G, lowercase g. And now the big question is, what is the phenotype of capital G, lowercase going to be? I'm sorry, capital G, lowercase g. What is the phenotype of that going to be? Capital G, lowercase g is going to be gray, or is it going to be black? Well, when we have capital G, lowercase g, we have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So, whatever the dominant trait is going to be, that's what we're going to see. And in this case, capital G is dominant, it is gray. Lowercase g is black, it is recessive, which means that the heterozygous phenotype is going to be gray. So, this is sort of the summary of what we've talked about today. We've looked at genes, we've looked at traits, we've looked at characteristics. We've looked at phenotypes of how things actually look that are observable with our eyes or they're measurable by scientific methods. We've looked at genotypes that are the combination of gene copies that an individual can have. We have different versions of a gene, which are called alleles. And we have two copies of genes for almost every trait. These two copies can be different, right? We can have homozygous recessive, which is two copies of the recessive allele. We can have two copies of the dominant allele, which is homozygous dominant, or we can have one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele, capital G, lowercase g. Then we have heterozygous. And dominant alleles are versions of the gene that overpower the recessive alleles. So if you have a dominant version of the gene with a recessive version of the gene, you're going to get the dominant phenotype. The dominant is going to overpower, or it's going to drown out the recessive version. So anyway, that is the end of our podcast video for right now. I really hope this was helpful. I hope that it made sense to you. I hope that it helped clear some things up. We'll do another video on genetics soon. We'll do another Punnett Square video that might be a podcast, or one where we go a little bit slower than we did in the live stream that I did last week. If you have any questions, let me know right now. We can take a couple minutes and answer some of the questions that you might have. If you have any questions that you don't want to add in the live stream right now, feel free to send me an email. My email is tyler@teasinOneday.com. Now, if you like how I teach, if it helps you, if you can learn from me, check out my website, teasinOneday.com. I have a whole bunch of TEAS resources. The TEAS resource that I'm probably most proud of is I have a full chemistry course for the TEAS. It covers all the most important chemistry topics that always show up on the TEAS. You can get that at my website, teasinOneday.com. I try to make stuff that is really, really high quality and also really, really affordable. So if you're struggling with science on the TEAS, specifically if you're studying with chemistry, check out my full course on my website. It has helped so many students get ready for chemistry on the TEAS, and I get really, 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 really positive reviews about that. So check it out, teasinOneday.com. If you want to know when I'm going to do a live stream, go to my website, teasinOneday.com, put your email in to my mailing list. You'll get like free chemistry study stuff. It doesn't matter if you don't want it. I'm not going to spam you all the time. I will just let you know when I'm going to do a live stream. Like that's the best way to get on my mailing list is just go to teasinOneday.com and put your name in, and then whenever I'm going to do a live stream, I'll let you know. So if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat right now, or you can just you can send me an email later. Always so happy to help. Always so happy to answer your questions. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and it's always so fun doing these with you guys. Let me know if you have any questions. Check out my website, teasinOneday.com, and I'll let you know when I do the next live stream. All right, I'll see you later.